Welcome to Chapter 6, Population and Ecology, Video 2. This is Ms. Lewison. In the last video, I mentioned R and K strategist, or R and K selected species. What this is a spectrum of reproductive strategies. At one end, you have K selected species, and at the other end is R selected species. Many species fall somewhere between K and R, having a combination of strategies from both of the selected species. K selected species have a slow reproductive rate. They usually have 1 to 2 offspring at a time. They have a long generation time and typically will only reproduce a few times in their lifetime, and typically only every few years, maybe once a year at the most. K selected species are often the larger mammals, some of the larger birds. Their mortality is most often dependent on density-dependent factors like competition for resources and disease. At the other end of the spectrum, there are R-selected species. R-selected species reproduce rapidly. They have a short generation time. They produce lots of offspring each time they reproduce, and they reproduce often. Examples of R-selected species would be insects and small fish. Their mortality is more likely to be affected by density-independent factors like forest fires and droughts. Most species fall somewhere along the spectrum and demonstrate characteristics from both K and R selected species. An example of this would be sea turtles. They are very K because they live 150 years and they don't reproduce until they're 35 years old or older, depending on the species, so that's a very long generation time. However, the female and the female lays eggs only once every 3 years. But on the other side, they lay 300 eggs and provide no parental care, so that is very R. So let's use this graphic to identify the different characteristics demonstrated by both K and R selected species. K selected species have a long lifespan. In other words, they live a long time. They have a long generation time, which means that they do not start reproducing until later in life or when they're older. They only reproduce a few times in their lifetime, usually every few years. In other words, they may only produce one offspring every 3 to 5 years. They also typically only produce 1 to 2 offspring at a time. Their offspring, the offspring that they do produce are usually larger and stronger, and they provide parental care. So they actually take care of their offspring to ensure their survival of that offspring. Due to all these factors, K selected species have a slow population growth rate, which means they are very slow to recover from decreases in their population size. So your K-selected species are more likely to become extinct or be the endangered species that are very, very slow to come back. K-selected species are also regulated more by density-dependent factors and usually have a logistic growth pattern, so they have a carrying capacity. On the other end of the spectrum are the R-selected species. They have a short lifespan. They may only live months or a few years. They start reproducing early in their lifespan, usually very young, sometimes literally at days or weeks old. They also produce a large number of offspring each time, so lay lots of eggs or make lots of babies and provide no parental care. They usually abandon them or don't really take care of them once they've hatched. With our selected species, they use their energy to produce a lot of offspring and just hope a few survive, while K-selected species put their energy into producing one offspring and caring for that offspring to try and ensure the offspring's survival. So those are just different strategies. Our selected species are more often affected by density-independent factors and demonstrate exponential growth or boom and bust cycles. An example is love bugs. They reproduce rapidly, have a short lifespan, and don't care for their young. Please be aware that there are several different names for K and R selected species, such as K and R strategists, but all of them use the K and the R. K is capital, it stands for the carrying capacity, and R is lowercase, and it's for growth rate. So if you see the K strategists, they are referring to these characteristics. So if you see anything other than, if you see K and R, this is what they're referring to, no matter what else they put with it. These reproductive strategies are very important, and you must know them. They relate to so many other things that we're going to talk about, like low biodiversity and endangerment and extinction and stuff like that you need to know these. And you need to know how they relate to population growth, endangerment, and survivorship curves, which we're going to talk about now. Survivorship curves. So let's talk about them. A survivorship curve demonstrates a species' relative ability to survive through their lifespan. There are 3 basic curve types. The first is type 1, or a late loss curve. This is a survivorship curve demonstrated by K-selected species. The type 2, or a constant loss curve, and a type 3, or early loss curve, where most individuals die early on and only a few make it to adulthood, which is demonstrated by your R-selected species. So looking at type 1, or the early loss curve, sorry, that's supposed to be late loss curve, you can see that there's a slight drop early on, as not all young survive. But once an organism makes it through the first couple of years, it is very likely to make it out to old age. Once the organisms reach old age, then there is a rapid decline due to death at old age. This curve is very typical of K-selected species like whales and humans. The type 2, or constant loss curve, is a relatively straight line. This demonstrates that the chance of dying never changes. It doesn't matter whether the organism is 2 years old or 6 years old. The chances of dying is always the same every single year of their life. This is typical of small songbirds and some rodents. The type 3 curve, or the early loss curve, occurs when most of the organisms die early in life, but the few that do survive will then live out to old age. This curve is very common for your R-selected species, such as plants. Plants produce hundreds, if not thousands, of seeds, but most never germinate or are eaten, and even the young plants are most often eaten. So only a few of those seeds will actually create adult plants that will then go on to reproduce. So that's an early loss curve. Remember that these are 3 types, but a specific species could fall somewhere in between these types. Moving on to a quick note, or a quick topic, metapopulations. Metapopulations occur when several distinct populations are able to function as one large population because organisms can move between the distinct populations. This will increase, This will increase genetic diversity and potentially increase the population's ability to adapt and survive. Metapopulations are created through corridors. As we continue to develop land, we need to keep this in mind and make sure populations do not become isolated from one another. Time to move on to the community ecology, or how species interact with one another. I am sure you have learned some of this before, but I also guarantee that I will add some new information. This is new information that is new, so make sure you are paying attention. And I can't talk today, I'm sorry. First up is competition. Competition occurs when there is not enough resources for all species. There are 2 types of competition. Intraspecific competition occurs between individuals of the same species, such as brown bear to brown bear competition. Intraspecific competition occurs when a species is around its carrying capacity. While this type of competition is detrimental to the individual, it is not harmful to the species as a whole. The other type of competition is interspecific competition. This is competition between different species, such as brown bear and to the coyote. This is the type of competition that determines a species' realized niche. If 2 species attempt to occupy the same niche at the same time, it will result in interspecific competition. There are 2 possible outcomes for interspecific competition. It can result in competitive exclusion, which occurs when one species outcompetes the other. If you look at the diagram on this page, these are 2 paramecium populations, when put together, one basically outcompetes the other. And if the trial was ran out further, the blue-lined paramecium would actually die out. So that's competitive exclusion, because it really, they're in a test tube. He can't resource partition. And they can't escape. They're going to die. Okay. The other species will be eliminated from the area, or they must leave or die. Again, that's competitive exclusion. This is what is occurring when a species is eliminated from a portion of its fundamental niche. The other potential outcome is resource partitioning. In resource partitioning, the species end up dividing the resource between themselves, or between the two species. There are different types of resource partitioning. Temporal resource partitioning occurs when two species end up using the same resource but at different times of the day. So one might become nocturnal. Spatial resource partitioning occurs when two species use different parts of the habitat. So they learn to share it in some way or split it up. And the third is morphological resource partitioning, when there is a change in the species' body size or shape, so that they are using the resource differently. The diagram, or this graph, shows how competition occurs when two species require the same resource. In the top graph, the area of overlap between them, right there, is where you are going to see competition. Over time, species 2 shifts towards a preference for larger sage, which reduces the competition. This is an example of morphological resource partitioning, because the bird probably ended up with a larger beak. Please be aware there will still always be a tiny bit of overlap here, even after the resource partitioning, because there's no drive for it to get further apart. So this just reduces down to a tiny little overlap, but it still will be always overlapped. This figure shows 5 different species of warbler and how they have partitioned trees so that they reduce overlap and reduce competition. So this is an example of spatial resource partitioning, and it's a classic example. Another type of interaction between species is predation. Predation is defined as when one species uses another species as a resource. There are different types of predation, and when I say predation, your first thought is probably what we refer to as a true predator, such as a lion or cheetah who is hunting and eating a gazelle. But herbivores are using plants, which are another species, as a resource. So by definition, herbivory, or being a herbivore, is also a predator. The other 2 types of predators are parasites and parasitoids. Parasites are species that live on or in other species, such as heartworm or fleas. And a parasitoid is a species that lays its eggs in another species. There are several species of wasps and spiders that will do this, as well as other insects. So kind of gross, but it occurs. Okay, a few more things, and then we're going to wrap up this video. Okay, just so you know a little bit more about predators, remember that there's a variety of ways they can use to catch their prey. They can walk, swim, fly, pursuit or chase, ambush, or even use chemical warfare and camouflage. On the other hand, prey can also use things to avoid being predated or being eaten. They can run, swim, fly, protect themselves with a shell or thorns. They can camouflage themselves so they aren't seen. They can use chemical warfare so they don't taste good or they're poisonous. They can use mimicry, where they mimic another animal that might not taste good or poisonous. So they use their same colorations to mistake the predator. And they can also use deceptive looks and behavior. They can try to look like a rock, or something like, there's lots of fish that look like rocks or seaweed, to try to not be eaten. Mutualism is another interaction that can occur between 2 different species. In a mutualistic relationship, it benefits both species. For example, plants and pollinators, or fish and cleaner shrimp. Here's a nice little picture of an impala who's providing a nice little meal for a bird who is eating parasites off the impala. Again, beneficial for both. You don't want parasites, so the impala is benefited and the bird gets an easy meal, so they're benefited as well. Nice picture of a fish with a cleaner shrimp going through and again removing parasites, which benefits both. Then there's commensalism. Commensalism is when one species benefits from the relationship, but the other species is neither benefited nor harmed, so they just don't care. It just doesn't matter to them. The shark and the remora are a good example. The shark could care less that the remora is there. The remora gets protection and the food scraps from the shark, and so it benefits. Another example would be epiphytes. These are plants that grow on other plants. They do not harm the plant they are growing on. Examples would be orchids or bromeliads, so they don't harm the tree, but they get a nice place higher in the sky to get light, sunlight, so they benefit. Let's go over a quick review using this diagram. Competition is harmful to both species involved. Predation benefits the predator and has a negative impact on the prey. Mutualism benefits both organisms, and commensalism benefits one organism and does not bother the other, so no effect on the other critter. So let's go ahead and wrap up video 2 for chapter 6. Please let me know if there is any questions you have or if you want me to explain or go over anything further in class. I would be happy to. And don't forget to watch video 3.